The sound of canvas tearing didn't sound like fabric. It sounded like a bone breaking, dry, sharp, and final. It was the sound of 5 years of marriage snapping in two, echoing off the cold marble walls of a house that never felt like a home. The silence in the penthouse was suffocating. It was the kind of silence that money bought, thick, insulated, and utterly devoid of warmth. Outside, the New York City skyline glittered like a jewelry box, but inside, the air was stale. Julian stood by the window, checking his watch for the 10th time. It was 8:30 p.m. The roast he had prepared was sitting in the warming drawer, likely drying out, much like his hope for the evening. When the elevator doors finally slid open, Elena didn't apologize. She walked in, tossing her Prada bag onto the sofa, the metal clasp clanking loudly against the leather. She was beautiful, undeniably so, with sharp features and eyes that could assess a person's net worth in a single glance. But tonight, she looked jagged. "Don't start, Julian," she said before he could even speak. She kicked off her heels. "The merger is a disaster. Mark and I have been putting out fires all day." Mark. The name was becoming a third wheel in their marriage, her managing partner. "Happy anniversary, Elena," Julian said softly, his voice steady despite the sting. Elena froze halfway to the kitchen. She blinked, the corporate armor slipping for a fraction of a second before she sighed. A long, weary exhale that sounded more like annoyance than regret. "God, is that today? Julian, I can't do this right now. I have to be back out in an hour for a strategy dinner." "I made something for you," Julian said, ignoring her dismissal. He walked over to the corner of the living room where a large object stood covered by a silk sheet. "Julian, please, not another painting," she groaned, rubbing her temples. "We don't have wall space, and frankly, I don't have the mental energy to pretend to critique it." "Just look, please." He pulled the sheet away. It was a large canvas, 4 feet by 5. It wasn't a flattering airbrushed portrait. It was visceral. Julian had painted Elena not as the powerful executive, but as he saw her in the rare, quiet moments, vulnerable, slightly fearful, looking out a window with a longing that she never admitted to. The colors were moody, deep blues, sharp grays, and a single streak of crimson cutting through the background. It was a masterpiece of perception. It stripped her naked. Elena stared at it. The silence stretched, heavy and dangerous. Is that how you see me?" she whispered. Her voice wasn't touched, it was cold. "I see the person under the suit, Elena. I see the woman who is tired of pretending." "You made me look weak," she snapped, her voice rising. "You made me look like a pathetic, sad little housewife looking out a window waiting for rescue. Is that what you think I am? Just some tragedy waiting for you to fix with your paintbrushes." "I made you look human," Julian countered, his defense crumbling. "I am a partner at a top-tier firm." She walked toward the easel, her movements sharp. "I pay the mortgage on this penthouse. I pay for those paints you use to waste your time while I'm out there in the real world fighting. And you paint me like a victim? I paint what is real, unlike you and unlike Mark." The mention of Mark triggered something. Her face flushed, her eyes narrowing into slits of pure venom. She grabbed the top of the canvas. "Real? You want real, Julian? Here is reality." She didn't just push it over. She dug her manicured nails into the edge of the canvas and pulled. Rip! The sound was nauseating. It was a scream of fabric, a violent separation of warp and weft. Julian flinched physically as if she had struck him across the face. She didn't stop. Fueled by a misdirected rage, guilt, stress, or perhaps the terrifying accuracy of the painting, she tore it down the center. The face of the woman in the painting was split in two. The vulnerability Julian had captured was now severed by a jagged, gaping wound. She threw the torn canvas onto the floor. It landed face up, the split face staring fast at the ceiling. "Grow up, Julian," she spat, breathless. "Get a real job. Stop projecting your insecurities onto me." She turned on her heel and marched toward the bedroom to change for her strategy dinner. Julian didn't move. He looked down at the destroyed painting. For 5 years, he had been the glue, the peacemaker, the one who smoothed over the cracks. He had absorbed her insults, her late nights, and the suspicion of where she really was. He looked at the torn edges of the canvas. The painting was ruined. But as he stared at the jagged tear, a strange calmness washed over him. The painting was destroyed, yes, but so was the illusion. He wasn't sad, he was done. His phone buzzed on the counter. It was a notification from their shared cloud account, a sync error. He glanced at it. It was a photo backup from Elena's phone. It was a selfie, Elena and Mark, in a hotel room, time-stamped 10 minutes ago. The caption she had drafted but not posted read, "Pre-game for the big night." Julian looked from the phone to the ripped painting. "Strategy dinner," he whispered to the empty room. He knelt down and gently picked up the two halves of the painting. He didn't cry. He felt a cold, steel resolve hardening in his chest. He wasn't going to throw this away. He was going to take it. And he was going to make sure she regretted every single thread she had severed. The sync error on the iPad screen didn't just show a photo, it showed coordinates. The geolocation tag was embedded right there in the metadata. The Meridian Hotel, Midtown. Julian stared at the image of his wife and Mark. In the photo, Elena's smile was genuine, a loose, relaxed expression he hadn't seen directed at him in years. With him, she was always tight, managed, efficient. With Mark, she looked free. That hurt more than the physical betrayal. It was the theft of her joy. She was giving the best parts of herself to someone else and bringing the cold, sharp edges home to Julian. He didn't smash the iPad. He didn't scream. A strange, numbing anesthesia took over his nervous system. He felt surgical. He walked into the bedroom. Elena had left in a whirlwind. Her discarded casual clothes were piled on the chaise lounge, and the room smelled faintly of her expensive perfume, Santal 33, and the hairspray she used when she wanted to impress. He opened the closet. He ignored his suits, the ones Elena had picked out for him for galas and charity dinners, where he stood silently by her side holding her clutch. Instead, he pulled out his old duffel bag, the canvas one covered in paint splatters from art school. He packed methodically. Jeans, t-shirts, his sketchbook, the few books that actually belonged to him and not the aesthetic of the apartment. He moved to the bathroom and swept his toiletries into a pouch. It took him less than 20 minutes to erase his footprint from the life they had built together. It was terrifyingly easy. It was as if he had been a guest in his own marriage all along. He carried the duffel bag out to the living room and set it by the door. Then, he turned to the studio corner. The shredded painting lay on the floor where she had thrown it. The canvas was warped, the fibers frayed and agonizingly exposed. He knelt down and picked up the two halves. He didn't roll them. The paint was too thick and textured. He found a large portfolio case, one he hadn't used in years, and carefully slid the two mutilated pieces inside. He treated them like a body being prepared for burial, with reverence and the silent promise of resurrection. He packed his brushes, his tubes of oil paint, his palette knives. These were his tools. They were the only things in this penthouse that didn't belong to Elena's checkbook. Before he left, he walked back to the easel. It stood empty now, a wooden skeleton in the dim light of the apartment. He looked at his left hand. The platinum band felt heavy, a shackle disguised as jewelry. He twisted it off. There was a pale band of skin underneath, a ghost of where the ring had sat for 5 years. He placed the ring on the narrow ledge of the easel. It sat there, cold and metallic, the only object left on the wooden frame. It was a statement more powerful than any note he could write. You destroyed the art. You don't get to keep the artist. Julian put on his coat and picked up the duffel bag and the portfolio. He took the elevator down to the garage. He didn't take the Range Rover. That was in her name. He walked out of the building and hailed a cab. "Where to?" the driver asked, chewing on a toothpick. Julian paused. He needed to be sure. He needed to see the lie with his own eyes, just once, to cauterize the wound so it wouldn't bleed later. "The Meridian Hotel," Julian said. Midtown. The ride was a blur of neon lights and wet asphalt. When they pulled up across the street from the hotel, Julian didn't have to wait long. The revolving doors spun, and there they were. Elena was laughing. She was clinging to Mark's arm, stumbling slightly in her heels. They weren't at a strategy dinner. They were clearly heading out to a bar or a club, drunk on expensive wine and the thrill of their deception. Mark whispered something in her ear, and she threw her head back, her hand resting intimately on his chest. She looked alive. She looked happy. Julian watched from the back seat of the cab, hidden by the tint and the night. The final thread of guilt snapped. He wasn't abandoning his wife. His wife had left the building years ago. He had just been living with her ghost. "Changed my mind," Julian said to the driver, his voice low and devoid of tremor. "Take me to Brooklyn, Bushwick." The driver grunted and pulled the car back into traffic. As the cab merged into the stream of taillights leaving Manhattan, Julian didn't look back at the hotel. He looked down at the black portfolio case resting against his knees. Inside lay the ruins of his work. Elena thought she had destroyed him. She thought ripping the canvas was the end of the conversation. She was wrong. She had just given him the opening line of a new story. He watched the city skyline recede across the bridge. For the first time in 5 years, the air in his lungs felt like his own. The apartment in Bushwick was a converted warehouse loft that smelled of dust, old brick, and industrial solvent. It was a violent shift from the sterile, marble-lined silence of the Manhattan penthouse. Here, the radiator clanked like a dying engine, and the sirens outside wailed with a frequency that made sleep impossible. It was raw. It was loud. It was exactly what Julian needed. For the first week, Julian didn't paint. He barely moved. He sat on a mattress on the floor, surrounded by boxes he hadn't unpacked, staring at the black portfolio case leaning against the peeling plaster wall. The grief was physical. It wasn't just the loss of Elena. It was the loss of the time he had wasted trying to be the man she wanted. He felt hollowed out, scraped clean like a palette at the end of a long day. He existed on bodega coffee and takeout noodles. He didn't check his phone. He had bought a burner with a new number and left the old iPhone, the one linked to their shared life, turned off in a drawer. If Elena was looking for him, she wasn't looking hard enough to find him physically. And if she wasn't looking, that was an answer in itself. On the 8th day, the rain started. It lashed against the single-pane windows, blurring the gray cityscape outside. Julian finally stood up. He walked to the portfolio and unzipped it. He pulled out the two halves of the painting. The tear was jagged. The canvas threads were frayed, white cotton guts spilling out from beneath the layers of oil paint. He laid the pieces on the floor, pushing them together. The face of his wife stared up at him, bisected. The left eye was on one piece, full of that hidden longing he had captured. The right eye was on the other, disconnected, lost. He tried to push the edges flush, but the canvas had warped slightly. It wouldn't heal seamlessly. There would always be a gap, a scar. He went to his supply box and dug out a heavy-duty adhesive and a needle with thick linen thread. His initial instinct was to fix it, to paint over the tear, to blend the colors until the damage was invisible, to pretend the violence had never happened. That was what he had done in his marriage for 5 years. He had painted over every insult, every late night, every cold shoulder, blending it all into a facade of a happy life. He stopped. His hand hovered over the canvas. Why hide it? The thought was quiet, but it rang in the empty loft like a bell. She had done this. The tear wasn't an accident. It was an act of definition. To hide the tear would be to lie about the history of the piece. He remembered a book he had read in college about kintsugi, the Japanese art of repairing broken pottery with lacquer dusted or mixed with powdered gold. The philosophy treated breakage and repair as part of the history of an object, rather than something to disguise. Julian stood up and rummaged through his supplies until he found a small, unopened packet he had bought years ago on impulse. 24-karat gold leaf. He didn't just glue the canvas back together, he stitched it. He took a thick awl and punched holes along the jagged edges of the tear. It felt barbaric, piercing the face he had painted with such tenderness, but it was necessary. He threaded a needle with heavy cord and began to lace the two halves together. He pulled tight, the tension creating a raised ridge down the center of the painting. It looked like a surgical suture. Then came the gold. He applied the adhesive along the scar, carefully tracing the jagged line of destruction. With bated breath, he laid the delicate sheets of gold leaf over the glue. The gold clung to the ridge, filling the gaps between the frayed threads, catching the dim light of the loft. He worked for hours, losing track of the sun setting and the streetlights flickering on. He didn't eat. He didn't drink. He was in a trance of creation and destruction. When he finally stepped back, his back aching and his fingers stained with glue and metal, he gasped. The painting had changed. It was no longer just a portrait of Elena. The woman in the painting was no longer simply vulnerable. She was shattered, yet held together by something precious. The gold scar running down her face didn't ruin the image. It electrified it. It drew the eye immediately to the fracture. It screamed, "I was broken, and this is where I survived." The crimson streak he had originally painted in the background now seemed to bleed into the gold, creating a contrast of violence and royalty. The painting wasn't sad anymore. It was tragic, majestic, and undeniably powerful. Julian wiped his hands on a rag. He felt a shift in his chest. The heavy, suffocating weight of the last week had lifted, replaced by a terrifying clarity. He wasn't just a painter anymore. He wasn't just Elena's husband. He was the alchemist who had turned her rage into gold. He picked up a piece of charcoal and walked to the bottom right corner of the canvas. For years, he had signed his work with a small, hesitant JM, hidden in the shadows of the composition, afraid to take up space. Not this time. He signed his full name, Julian Moore, in bold, deliberate strokes. He looked at the woman in the painting. "You tried to destroy me," he whispered to the canvas. "Thank you." He slept that night without dreams, deep and heavy. The next morning, he wouldn't just be surviving, he would be planning. The world needed to see this, not for fame, but for the truth. Elias Vance was a man who had seen everything. As the owner of the Foundry, a gallery in Chelsea known for launching careers and ending them with equal efficiency, he was bored. He sipped his lukewarm espresso, scrolling through digital submissions on his tablet with the lethargy of a man who had forgotten what it felt like to be surprised. When the buzzer rang, he ignored it. It rang again, persistent, not desperate. Elias sighed and buzzed the door open. Julian walked in. He looked different than the man who had left the penthouse weeks ago. He was thinner, his beard was untrimmed, and his clothes were covered in faint smears of charcoal and gold dust. But his eyes were clear. He carried the large portfolio case with a grip that turned his knuckles white. "I don't take walk-ins," Elias said without looking up. "You'll take this one," Julian said. His voice wasn't loud, but it had a weight to it that made Elias pause. Julian didn't wait for permission. He unzipped the case and pulled out the canvas. He didn't lean it against a wall. He held it up, his arms framing the work. Elias looked up. He adjusted his glasses. Then he stood up. The gallery was silent, save for the hum of the HVAC system. Elias walked around his desk, approaching the painting as if it were a dangerous animal. He leaned in close, staring at the jagged ridge of gold that split the woman's face. He traced the air above the scar with his finger. "Kintsugi," Elias murmured. "On canvas. I've never seen it done like this." "It's not just technique," Julian said. "It's history." Elias looked at Julian, really seeing him for the first time. "Who ripped it?" "She did," Julian answered simply. "The muse." Elias let out a low whistle. He stepped back, viewing the piece from a distance. The gold leaf caught the track lighting, blazing like a lightning bolt through a storm. It turned a portrait of a sad woman into an icon of survival. It was violent, beautiful, and incredibly expensive looking. "This is the centerpiece," Elias declared, the boredom completely gone from his voice. "I have a slot opening in 6 weeks. The theme is rupture. I was going to cancel it because the submissions were garbage. But this This is the anchor. Can you give me 10 more pieces like this? Not the gold necessarily, but this raw, unadulterated honesty? I have nothing else to do but paint, Julian said. Good, get to work. We're going to make you a star, and we're going to make sure she sees it. 5 miles uptown, the atmosphere was decidedly less electric. Elena sat across from Mark at Le Cuckoo, twirling the stem of her martini glass. The restaurant was buzzing, filled with the city's elite, but the air between them was stagnant. It had been a month since Julian left. The first week had been a whirlwind of adrenaline, the freedom, the lack of guilt, the thrill of finally being with Mark openly. But the high was wearing off, leaving behind a hangover that aspirin couldn't touch. Mark was checking his phone. Again. Are we expecting a third? Elena asked, trying to keep her tone light, though the acid was rising in her throat. Mark glanced up, his smile not quite reaching his eyes. Just work, babe. The merger is entering the due diligence phase. It's a nightmare. We used to talk about work, Elena said. You used to love strategizing with me. Yeah, well, that was when we were sneaking around in break rooms, Mark chuckled, taking a sip of his scotch. The risk made the spreadsheets sexy. Now it's just spreadsheets. The comment hung in the air, careless and cruel. Elena felt a cold knot tighten in her stomach. Is that what I was? She asked quietly. A risk? Mark sighed, putting his phone down with exaggerated patience. Don't be dramatic, Elena. You know what I mean. The chase is part of the fun. We won. You're free. I'm here. Let's just enjoy the dinner. But he didn't look like he was enjoying it. He looked distracted. His eyes kept wandering to the door, to the waitress, to his phone. Elena looked at him, really looked at him, and felt a sudden, terrifying vertigo. Without the secrecy, without the thrill of the forbidden, Mark was just a man in a suit who checked his emails during dinner. He wasn't a savior. He wasn't a soulmate. He was just a guy who liked winning things he wasn't supposed to have. And Julian? Julian had never checked his phone at dinner. Julian had cooked for her. Julian had looked at her with an intensity that she had mistaken for weakness, but she was starting to realize was actually focus. I need to go to the ladies' room, Elena said abruptly. She walked to the bathroom, her legs feeling unsteady. Inside the marble sanctuary, she leaned against the sink and looked at herself in the mirror. She looked perfect. Her hair was done, her makeup flawless, but her eyes looked empty. She pulled out her phone. Her thumb hovered over Julian's name in her contacts. She hadn't called him once. She had been too proud, too angry, too convinced that he would come crawling back when his money ran out. He hadn't come back. She pressed the call button. The number you have dialed is no longer in service. Please check the number and try again. The mechanical voice was a slap in the face. He hadn't just left, he had disconnected. Elena lowered the phone. For the first time since the night she ripped the painting, fear pierced her arrogance. She was alone. She was sitting in a French restaurant with a man who was already bored of her, and the man who had adored her had erased himself from existence. She went back to the table. Mark had ordered another drink. Everything okay? He asked, barely looking up. Fine, Elena lied. She took a long swallow of her martini. It tasted like water. Down in Chelsea, Julian was dipping his brush into a mixture of oil and ash, preparing to paint his next scar. He wasn't thinking about her. He was thinking about the light. The weeks bled into a month, and the distance between Bushwick and the Upper East Side became more than just geography. It was a divide between two different realities. In the drafty loft, Julian was exhausted, but it was the good kind of exhaustion, the kind that settles into the bones after a day of honest labor. He was no longer just stitching canvas. He was building a body of work. The fractured muse had grown from a single piece into a series. He painted objects he found on the street, a broken chair, a shattered mirror, a crushed violin, and applied the kintsugi technique to them on canvas, rendering their brokenness in hyper-realistic oil and gold. He woke up at 5 a.m. without an alarm. He brewed coffee in a mocha pot that hissed on the hot plate. There was no dread in his chest anymore. When he was with Elena, He used to wake up with a tightness in his throat, bracing himself for her mood, her schedule, her demands. Now, the only demands were the ones the canvas made of him. Elias visited on a Tuesday. He walked around the studio, stepping over paint rags. He stopped in front of a new piece, a painting of a wilting orchid, its stem snapped but bound together with thick, impasto gold paint. "It's better than I thought," Elias said, his voice low. "You're not just angry, Julian. You're healing. The critics are going to eat this up. It's a redemption arc on a wall." Elias handed him an envelope, an advance, for materials, and maybe a better heater. Julian opened it. The check was for $5,000. It was a fraction of what Elena spent on a weekend getaway, but holding it, Julian felt a surge of pride that nearly brought him to his knees. It was his. Every cent of it was earned from his pain and his skill. He didn't have to say thank you to anyone but himself. In the penthouse, the silence had turned from cold to rotting. Elena walked into the apartment at 9 p.m. The lights were off. The air smelled stale, a mix of dust and the garbage she hadn't taken out in 3 days. "Hello?" she called out, purely out of habit. Only the hum of the refrigerator answered. She threw her keys on the counter and looked around. The place was falling apart in subtle, maddening ways. The orchid on the dining table, the one Julian used to mist every morning, was brown and shriveled, its dead petals littering the mahogany. A pile of dry cleaning sat on the chair by the door, still wrapped in plastic because she kept forgetting to put it away. She opened the fridge. A bottle of white wine, a jar of artisanal mustard, and a takeout container of Thai food from 2 nights ago. She slammed the door shut. "Damn it," she hissed. She pulled out her phone to text Mark. "Dinner? I'm starving. My place?" 3 dots appeared, then disappeared, then appeared again. "Can't tonight," the message finally read. "Caught up with the legal team. Rain check?" "Rain check," she whispered, reading the word like a sentence. It was the 3rd time this week. The due diligence phase seemed to cover a lot of late nights that didn't involve her. She poured a glass of wine for dinner and sat on the expensive Italian sofa. It felt too big. Without Julian filling the space, without the smell of his cooking, the sound of his jazz records, the sight of him sketching in the corner, the apartment felt like a museum exhibit after closing time. She realized then that Julian hadn't just been a husband. He had been the curator of their life. He made the house a home. He remembered birthdays. He managed the cleaning lady. He watered the plants. He softened the edges of her sharp corporate existence. Without him, she was just a woman in a box in the sky. Restless, she stood up and walked toward the spare room he had used as a studio. She hadn't gone in there since the night she ripped the painting. She told herself she was too busy, but the truth was she was afraid of what she would find. She pushed the door open. The room was stripped bare. The smell of turpentine and linseed oil still lingered, a ghost of his presence. The floor was clean, save for a few specks of dried paint. And there, in the center of the room, stood the easel. It was empty. But on the small wooden ledge where he used to rest his brushes, something glinted. Elena walked over. Her breath hitched. It was his wedding ring, platinum, simple, abandoned. She picked it up. It was cold. She remembered the day she put it on his finger. She remembered promising to love him, to cherish him. She remembered thinking she had won a prize, a handsome, talented man who adored her. She squeezed the ring in her fist until the metal dug into her palm. "You think you can just disappear?" she said to the empty room, her voice trembling with a mix of rage and rising panic. She marched back to the living room and grabbed her laptop. She logged into their joint bank account. She would track his spending. She would find out where he was buying coffee, where he was paying rent. She would corner him. Access denied. She blinked. She typed the password again. Account closed. She stared at the screen. The joint savings, the checking account, gone. He had withdrawn exactly half of the balance, down to the cent, and closed the accounts 3 weeks ago. She checked the credit cards. He had removed himself as an authorized user. He hadn't just moved out, he had severed the limb. Elena sat back, the laptop sliding off her lap onto the floor. The realization hit her like a physical blow. Julian wasn't pouting. He wasn't waiting for an apology. He was building a life that didn't include her. For the first time in her life, Elena felt small. She looked at the dead orchid on the table. "Mark?" she said aloud, testing the name. It sounded hollow. Mark was a distraction. Julian was the foundation, and she had taken a sledgehammer to him. She grabbed the bottle of wine and drank directly from it. The alcohol burned, but it didn't warm her. Nothing in this house would ever be warm again. In Bushwick, Julian dipped a fine brush into the gold lacquer. He held his breath, steadying his hand. He applied the final stroke to the canvas. It was finished. He stepped back. The painting glowed in the dim light. It was a masterpiece of broken things made whole. He felt a profound sense of peace settle over him, lighter than air, stronger than steel. He was ready to show the world. New York City loves a secret, especially one wrapped in gold. 2 weeks before the opening night, the posters appeared. They were minimalist, stark, and arresting. They didn't feature a name or a face. They simply showed a close-up of a jagged tear in a canvas, stitched together with a vein of shimmering gold leaf. Below the image, in sharp sans serif font, were just 3 words: Rupture, The Foundry, 11/15. There was no artist biography, no press release. Elias Vance was a master manipulator of the art market, and he knew that in an age of oversharing, anonymity was the ultimate luxury. The rumor mill began to churn immediately. Was it a recluse from Berlin, a resurrected prodigy from the 90s? The silence from the gallery only amplified the noise. By the time the digital invitations were sent out, Rupture wasn't just an art show, it was the event of the season. Elena sat in her corner office, staring at her reflection in the darkened window. It was 7 p.m., and the office was mostly empty. The merger deal, the one she had sacrificed her marriage for, was stalling. The client was getting cold feet, sensing the instability in the team. Mark had been unavailable for their 4 p.m. briefing, citing a dentist appointment that Elena knew was a lie. He had been seen having lunch with a junior associate from the litigation department, a woman 10 years younger than Elena, with a laugh that carried down the hallway. Elena felt the walls closing in. She was losing her grip. At work, she was becoming the difficult partner. At home, she was living in a mausoleum of dead plants and dust. She needed a win. She needed to be seen. She needed to remind everyone, and herself, that she was Elena Vance, no relation to the curator, a woman of taste, power, and influence. She opened her email and scrolled through her invites. Charity galas, boring fundraisers, corporate dinners, nothing that screamed relevance. Then she saw the email chain from her friend Chloe, a socialite who treated gallery openings like competitive sports. Did you get into the Foundry event? Apparently, the waiting list is impossible. Even the mayor is trying to get a +1. Who is this artist? Rumor is it's someone huge operating under a pseudonym. Elena's eyes narrowed. The Foundry. She knew Elias Vance vaguely. He had sold them a mediocre abstract piece for the lobby 3 years ago. She picked up her phone and dialed the gallery. The Foundry, this is reception. This is Elena, from the Sterling and Hart firm. I need to speak to Elias. I'm afraid Mr. Vance is in meetings all week preparing for the show. Can I take a message? Tell him I'm looking for 2 VIP passes for Friday night. I'm looking to acquire a piece for our corporate collection. The lie slipped out easily. She had no budget for art, but money was the only language people like Elias spoke. I'll pass the message along, but the guest list is extremely tight, ma'am. Elena hung up, frustrated. She drummed her fingers on the desk. She wouldn't take no for an answer. She pulled up her contacts and found Mark's name. Despite everything, he was still the most connected person she knew. Get me into the Foundry opening on Friday. I don't care who you have to bribe. We need to be seen there. It's good for the merger optics. She framed it as business. It was always business. Mark replied an hour later. Done. Cost me a favor with a city councilman. Pick you up at 7. Elena let out a breath she didn't know she was holding. She had a ticket. She had a date. She was going to the most exclusive event in the city. For a moment, the crushing weight of her solitude lifted. She wasn't a discarded wife. She was a power player. In the back room of the foundry, Julian stood in front of the final layout. The gallery was transformed. The walls were painted a deep, matte charcoal, making the gold in the paintings pop with almost violent intensity. There were 12 pieces in total. The fractured muse was the centerpiece, hung at the far end of the room, lit by a single spotlight. It looked sacred and terrifying. "You ready for this?" Elias asked, walking up behind him with 2 bottles of beer. Julian took one. His hands were steady, but his stomach was churning. "Do I have to talk to them?" "Only if you want to. I've billed you as the alchemist. No name, no face. You can stand in the crowd and listen to them praise you without them knowing you're the one holding the beer. It's a rare power, Julian." "And the guest list?" Julian asked. Elias smirked. He pulled a folded sheet of paper from his pocket. "I thought you might ask. She called. Twice. Then her boyfriend called. They're on the list." Julian froze. "You let them in?" "You wanted her to see it, didn't you?" Elias said, his voice dropping the salesman act. "You didn't paint this for the critics, Julian. You painted it for her. Or rather, to get over her. If she doesn't see it, the circle isn't closed." Julian looked at the list. Elena and guest. He felt a cold resolve settle over him. He wasn't afraid of her anymore. The woman who had ripped his painting was a memory. The woman walking into this gallery on Friday was just a subject, a muse who didn't know she had been captured. "Let them in," Julian said, taking a sip of the beer. "Front row seats." "What are you going to wear?" Elias asked. Julian looked down at his paint-stained jeans. "A tuxedo. If I'm going to attend my own funeral, I might as well dress for the occasion." "It's not a funeral, kid," Elias said, clapping him on the shoulder. "It's a resurrection." On Friday evening, Elena spent 3 hours getting ready. She wore a backless black gown that cost more than Julian's car. She hired a professional makeup artist to hide the dark circles under her eyes. She put on diamond earrings that caught the light with every turn of her head. When Mark arrived, he looked handsome in his tux, but his eyes were glazed, smelling faintly of scotch and mints. "You look expensive," he said, kissing her cheek. It was a compliment, but it felt like an appraisal. "Let's go," Elena said, grabbing her clutch. "I want to be there when the doors open." They sat in the back of the town car, moving through the traffic toward Chelsea. Elena stared out the window, watching the city blur. She felt a strange buzzing in her fingertips. She told herself it was excitement, but deep down, it felt like a warning. She was walking towards something that would change her life. She just thought it was going to be a party. She had no idea she was walking into a mirror. The foundry was breathing. That was the only way to describe it. The air inside the gallery was thick with the scent of expensive perfume, dry champagne, and the electric hum of judgment. New York's cultural elite had packed into the space, shoulder to shoulder, moving in a slow, murmuring tide around the perimeter of the room. Elena entered with Mark, her hand gripping his arm tight enough to leave a mark. She scanned the room immediately, her eyes darting over the heads of critics and collectors, looking for faces that mattered. "It's crowded," Mark muttered, adjusting his bow tie. He looked bored already. "Let's do a lap, say hello to the councilman, and get a drink. I hate standing." "Wait," Elena said, stopping abruptly. She was looking at the wall to her left. Hanging there was a small canvas, no larger than a notepad. It depicted a coffee mug, a specific ceramic mug with a chipped rim that she had thrown against the wall during an argument 3 years ago. In the painting, the shattered ceramic was reassembled, the cracks flowing with thick, radiant gold. It wasn't just a painting of a mug. It was a painting of a memory she had suppressed. Her stomach gave a violent lurch. "Interesting texture," Mark said, glancing at it without seeing it. "Gold glue? A bit kitschy, isn't it?" Elena didn't answer. She pulled him forward, her heart hammering against her ribs. The next piece was a violin. Julian's grandfather's violin. She had accidentally knocked it over while vacuuming in a rush and never told him, just hid the pieces in the back of the closet. Here it was, resurrected on canvas, the broken neck fused with gold leaf, singing a silent song of repair. "Elena, you're hurting my arm," Mark hissed. "It's him," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Who?" "Julian." Mark laughed, a short, barking sound. "Your house husband. Elena, please, this is the foundry. Julian paints sad little trees. He doesn't have a show in Chelsea." But Elena was already moving. She let go of Mark and pushed into the crowd. She followed the gaze of the room. Everyone was looking toward the far wall, where a semicircle of admirers had formed a protective barrier around the main exhibit. She elbowed past a woman in a fur coat. She stepped around a critic scribbling furiously in a notebook. She broke through the line, and there she was. The painting was massive. It dominated the space. It was the portrait of her, the one she had sneered at, the one she had called weak. But it was no longer the painting she remembered. The tear she had inflicted was the focal point. It ran down the center of her face, a jagged canyon of destruction. But Julian hadn't hidden it. He had filled it with 24-karat gold. The gold caught the gallery lights, blazing with a holy intensity. It split her face, yet held it together. The expression in the painted eyes was no longer just longing. It was a survivor's gaze, peering out from behind the golden scar. The title card beside it read simply, "Portrait of a Fracture. Oil and gold on canvas. Not for sale." Elena felt the blood drain from her face. She felt naked. Every person in this room was staring at her most intimate moment of cruelty, and they were calling it beautiful. They were admiring the wreckage she had caused. "Magnificent, isn't it?" The voice came from beside her. She turned. Julian stood there. He looked nothing like the man she had lived with. The slump in his shoulders was gone. He wore a fitted tuxedo that made him look taller, leaner. His hair was groomed, his beard trimmed. But it was his eyes that stopped her. They were clear. They held no pleading, no apology, no adoration. They were the eyes of a stranger. "Julian," she choked out. The crowd around them quieted, sensing the tension. Heads turned. The alchemist had been found. "Hello, Elena," he said. His voice was calm, resonant. "I'm glad you came. I wasn't sure if you liked art." She struggled to find her footing. The shock was turning into defensive anger. "You had no right. This is me. That is my face." "Is it?" Julian asked, tilting his head slightly. "I don't think so. That woman in the painting is broken. You look quite put together tonight." "You stole this," she hissed, stepping closer, lowering her voice so only the immediate circle could hear. "I ripped that painting. I destroyed it. You're taking credit for my action." "You're right," Julian said, loud enough for the critic nearby to hear. "You did the breaking. I did the mending. That's the division of labor, isn't it? That was always our dynamic." Mark appeared at her elbow, looking flustered. He saw Julian and stopped dead. "Julian, what the hell is going on?" Julian looked at Mark. He didn't look angry. He looked at Mark with the mild curiosity one might have for a dull insect. "Hello, Mark. Thank you for the inspiration," Julian said. He gestured to the painting. "Without the stress fracture you helped apply to the structure, the gold wouldn't have had anywhere to go." A ripple of nervous laughter went through the crowd. Mark turned a shade of crimson that clashed with the art. He took a step back, physically distancing himself from Elena. Elena saw the movement. She saw Mark retreat. She looked back at Julian. She realized with a terrifying clarity that she was losing. She tried one last desperate play, the one that always worked. She tried to be the victim. "I supported you for 5 years," she said, her voice trembling, tears welling up in her eyes. Real tears this time, born of humiliation. "I gave you a home. I gave you a life, and you humiliate me in public, after everything I did for you." The room went silent. Everyone loved a scandal. Julian stepped closer. He didn't flinch. He didn't soften. "You didn't give me a life, Elena. You hired me to be an extra in yours," Julian said softly, but the acoustics of the gallery carried his words to every corner. "And as for humiliating you, I didn't paint your name on the card. I didn't tell anyone who she was. You're the one standing here, claiming the wreckage. If you see yourself in the broken things, that's not my brushstroke. That's your conscience." He turned his back on her. "Elias," Julian called out to the curator, "I think we're ready to open the champagne." He walked away. He didn't look back. He left her standing in front of the golden scar, wearing a gown that cost a fortune, standing next to a lover who was already checking the exit signs, feeling smaller than she had ever felt in her life. The crowd hesitated for a second, then turned their backs on her too, following the artist. She was left alone with her portrait. The gold leaf shimmered under the lights, bright and hard and unbreakable. The sidewalk outside the foundry was slick with rain, reflecting the neon chaos of the city. Elena stood by the curb, shivering not from the cold, but from a shock that went down to the marrow. Mark hadn't waited. He had muttered something about an early flight and hailed a separate cab before she could even get her coat from the check room. It was a cowardly exit, but fitting. He was a man who liked shiny things, and tonight, Elena had been revealed as tarnished. She hailed a taxi, her arm heavy as lead. When she climbed into the back seat, the silence of the vehicle felt like a coffin. She gave her address, the penthouse address, the one she used to say with pride, and leaned her head against the cool glass. As the city blurred past, she didn't see the streets. She saw the gold. She saw that jagged line running down the center of the canvas. She had done that. She had ripped the fabric of their life in a moment of arrogant fury, thinking it was trash. Julian had picked it up, not to fix it for her, but to fix it for himself. She arrived at the building and rode the elevator up alone. The penthouse was exactly as she had left it, immaculate, expensive, and dead. She walked into the living room and kicked off her heels. She poured a glass of wine, but her hands shook so badly that red liquid splashed onto the white marble counter. She stared at the stain. It looked like blood. She walked to the window. The view of the city was still there, the millions of lights, the promise of power. But for the first time, Elena realized she was just one of the lights, flickering and alone. She had traded a man who saw her soul for a man who only looked at her surface, and now she had neither. She sat on the floor where the painting had once stood. She traced the pattern of the rug with her finger. There was no gold here, only the empty space where art used to be. She realized then that the tragedy wasn't that Julian was gone. The tragedy was that he had become a masterpiece, and she was just the hammer that broke him. Inside the gallery, the last guests were filtering out. The air was still buzzing with the energy of success. Red dots, the universal symbol of sold, sat next to almost every painting. The fractured muse remained unmarked as promised. It wasn't for sale, it belonged to the artist. Elias walked over to where Julian was sitting on a bench staring at the portrait. "You did it, kid," Elias said, loosening his tie. "The critics are calling it a visceral triumph. You're not just on the map, you are the map." Julian smiled, but it was a quiet, tired smile. "It's funny," he said. "What is?" "I thought I wanted her to see it so I could hurt her," Julian admitted, his voice low. "I thought I wanted revenge. But when I saw her standing there, looking so small, I didn't feel angry. I just felt free." Elias nodded. "That's the difference between petty and powerful. You didn't scream, you just outgrew her." Julian stood up. He walked over to the painting and touched the frame gently. "I'm keeping this one, not as a trophy, but as a reminder." "A reminder of what?" "That things are stronger where they are broken." He picked up his coat. He didn't look back at the painting of Elena. He didn't need to. He had memorized the lesson. He walked out of the gallery and into the crisp November night. The rain had stopped, leaving the air scrubbed clean. He hailed a cab, but this time he didn't give a destination in Manhattan. "Brooklyn," he said. "Bushwick." As the car crossed the bridge, Julian looked out at the skyline. He thought about the kintsugi technique. The gold didn't hide the crack, it honored it. It said to the world, "This object has a history. It has suffered damage, and by that damage, it has become more beautiful." He looked at his hands. They were the same hands that had cooked her dinner, the same hands that had held her when she cried, the same hands she had dismissed as useless. But they were also the hands that had stitched a life back together from scraps. He wasn't Julian the husband anymore. He wasn't Julian the victim. He took a deep breath, filling his lungs with the cold, sharp air of a new beginning. The scar on the canvas was gold. The scar on his heart was wisdom. And as the lights of the city receded behind him, Julian realized the most important truth of all. The artist never belongs to the muse. The muse is just the spark. The fire belongs to the one who keeps burning. He closed his eyes, and for the first time in years, he didn't dream of falling. He dreamed of flying.